All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we are diving headfirst into the absolute heart-pounding, life-or-death reality of the Apollo 11 moon landing. We usually picture this historic event as just a completely flawless triumph of human engineering, right? But behind those iconic quotes and the famous black and white photos, there's actually a hidden story. We're talking desperate survival, rapid-fire science, and yeah, some pretty intense modern-day suspicion.
So picture this. Imagine the sheer terror. Shortly after touching down on the moon, Neil Armstrong is struggling to squeeze out of a super cramped exit in his bulky, highly pressurized spacesuit. And during that struggle, he accidentally bumps into a panel and completely snaps off a vital piece of equipment, the ascent engine arming switch. And get this, because there's literally no air on the moon to carry sound, they didn't even hear it snap. But without that exact switch, they had absolutely zero way to fire the engines to leave the surface. One clumsy bump almost left two men stranded up there forever.
To really understand this, we need to look at Section 1, a high-stakes space race. So how did these astronauts end up in such a terrifying, rushed predicament millions of miles from home? Well, we have to look back at the intense geopolitical pressure of the Cold War. The US was pretty much constantly trailing behind the Soviet Union. In 1957, the Soviets totally shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the very first artificial satellite. Then, 1961 rolls around, and they beat America again by sending Yuri Gagarin into space. Just days later, aiming for a massive, dramatic victory, President John F. Kennedy set what seemed like an impossible deadline: land a man on the moon before the decade was out. And that end-of-decade mandate, it forced NASA into a frenzied and, honestly, incredibly dangerous development cycle.
Just 2 to 3 months. That was the astonishingly brief gap between major test missions as NASA literally sprinted to meet Kennedy's deadline. I mean, they were testing rockets, heat shields, lunar modules, the whole shebang at a breakneck pace. But, this rush came with a really devastating cost. In 1967, a tragic fire in the Apollo 1 cabin killed 3 astronauts right there on the launch pad. Yet, driven by the space race, NASA couldn't stop. They just pushed forward relentlessly, launching mission after mission until the ultimate test in the summer of 1969.
Which brings us to Section 2, the perilous Apollo 11 mission. When that massive 3 million kilogram Saturn V rocket finally launched in July of 1969, the mission was incredibly complex and just fraught with peril at literally every single stage. The spacecraft was actually broken into 3 main components: Columbia, which was the command module, the service module, and the lunar module, known as the Eagle. Now, this specific setup meant astronaut Michael Collins had to stay behind and orbit the moon completely alone in the command module. That left only Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to descend in the Eagle and face the unknown dangers of the lunar surface. And here's the kicker: if the Eagle couldn't get back up to Collins, there was absolutely no rescue vehicle waiting for them. And wow, the descent was anything but smooth. As the Eagle headed toward the surface, the astronauts were suddenly hit with these blaring 1201 and 1202 system alarms. At first, neither Armstrong nor Aldrin even knew what those meant. It turned out the Apollo guidance computer was dangerously overloaded with processing data. And on top of that, Armstrong looks out the window and realizes the automatic computer is guiding them straight into a field of massive, incredibly dangerous boulders. He had to instantly grab manual control of the spacecraft just to find a safe spot to land. 30 seconds. That is exactly how much fuel they had left when they finally touched down. As Armstrong was manually flying over that boulder field, Mission Control back on Earth was anxiously counting down their critical fuel state. If he hadn't touched down within that final 30-second window, they would have had to abort the landing entirely. It was just an impossibly slim margin of error to make history. All right, moving on to Section 3, the ballpoint pen rescue. So they land safely, step outside, do their thing, setting up scientific instruments, collecting about 23 kilograms of moon rocks. But when they get back inside the Eagle, they realize the horrific truth about that broken engine switch we talked about earlier. The broken switch meant the circuit to fire the ascent engine was completely dead. But then Buzz Aldrin looks at the broken mechanism and realizes they just needed something physically conductive to bridge the gap where the switch used to be. He ingeniously pulls out his standard felt-tipped ballpoint pen and just jams it right into the opening, successfully completing the electrical circuit. I mean, that simple, everyday object reignited the engine and literally saved their lives. How wild is that? But hey, the danger wasn't over. Their return to Earth was equally harrowing.
Right before re-entry, the thrusters on the service module, which were supposed to push it safely away from the astronauts' command module, they failed. This meant massive pieces of burning debris from the service module were flying dangerously close to their fragile little craft. The risk of death was so extraordinarily high throughout this entire journey that President Richard Nixon actually had an alternate speech prepared. It chillingly began, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace." It is genuinely terrifying to think about what almost was. Now let's look at Section 4, debunking the moon myths. Miraculously, they survived that chaotic re-entry, splashing down safely and returning as absolute global heroes. Yet today, decades later, you still hear these persistent conspiracy theories claiming the entire event was just a staged Hollywood hoax. But honestly, a little simple engineering completely debunks the most famous myth, the fluttering flag. So conspiracy theorists claim the flag is blowing in the wind on a soundstage, right? Because obviously there's no air on the moon. Well, the fact is, NASA specifically designed this flag with a horizontal rod right across the top so it wouldn't just hang limply. That rod got stuck and didn't extend fully, which created a rippled effect in the fabric. The only time the flag actually moved was when the astronauts were physically twisting the aluminum pole into the dirt, causing it to act like a giant spring. Other photographic myths? They're easily busted by some basic camera knowledge. People always ask, "Hey, why are there no stars in the photos?" Well, it was lunar daytime. The bright, highly reflective spacesuits meant the cameras had to use really fast exposure times, which simply cannot capture faint starlight. And what about those bizarre intersecting shadows? The moon's incredibly reflective surface basically acted as a giant secondary light source, bouncing light absolutely everywhere. Oh, and that camera visible in an astronaut's visor reflection? He wasn't holding it. Those cameras were permanently mounted directly to the front of their spacesuits. But honestly, perhaps the most logical proof of all comes from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which officially recorded the Apollo 11 moon landing as a factual, historic space-age event. Remember, this was the absolute peak of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was America's fiercest rival, and they were tracking their every single move in space. If there was even a tiny shred of evidence that the landing was faked, the Soviets would have loudly exposed it to the whole world. But instead, they acknowledged America's incredible achievement. Let's wrap things up with Section 5, the real Apollo legacy. While those movie set conspiracies quickly fall apart under basic scientific scrutiny, there actually were some very real, valid, and contemporary criticisms about the staggering financial reality of the mission. The total cost of the Apollo program back in the 1960s was $24 billion. Adjusted for inflation, that is well over $100 billion in today's money. At a time when the United States was deeply embroiled in the Vietnam War and facing massive domestic issues regarding education and inequality, a lot of citizens and journalists fiercely protested this unbelievable expenditure. And this created a really fascinating historical debate. On one hand, as the New York Times pointed out back in 1962, the money spent on Apollo could have funded the creation of 120 Harvard-sized universities across the country. I mean, that is a massive potential investment in society. But on the flip side, NASA's intense demand for flawless, lightweight, integrated circuits to safely guide human lives, it completely accelerated the microchip industry. Because NASA bought so many chips, IBM was able to drop component prices by 90% in just 5 years. So this technological boom essentially kickstarted the entire modern computing era that you and I rely on today. Which brings us right to the future. With NASA's new Artemis program actively aiming to send a brand new generation of astronauts, including the first woman and first person of color, back to the moon by the end of this decade, we are entering a whole new age. So, what unpredictable technological leaps will this next era of exploration bring to our daily lives? And, will the innovations justify the massive costs this time around? Keep that question in the back of your mind as we watch humanity return to the lunar surface. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.